if your overall goal is progress and growth, you do want to assess your training logs. And over a reasonable time frame, you should be seeing performance trending up in the stuff you're focusing on. And let's say, early, mid stage, intermediate, you're not specializing on any muscle group yet. You're still running, let's say, an upper lower split, and you want generally everything to grow.
Wits and Weights community, welcome to another episode of the Wits and Weights podcast. He is back. Dr. Eric Helms, fresh off of earning his WNBF Pro Card, joins me for the second time despite his very busy contest schedule. Last time Eric was on the show, we discussed balancing strength and physique goals, programming for lifters at different experience levels, self-determination theory, and optimal protein sources. So check out episode 72 for that conversation. I'll keep the intro a bit shorter this time around. Eric Helms is a titan in the bodybuilding and nutrition world, a researcher, author, coach who specializes in physique and strength sports. He has a PhD in strength and conditioning, is a competitive natural bodybuilder and powerlifter, the co-founder of Mass Research Review, and the chief science officer of 3D Muscle Journey. Today, we're going to get caught up on his recent exploits in the bodybuilding world and then dive into some of the nuances of nutrition and training, from levels of tracking and flexible dieting to macro splits to mini cuts. We'll also get into training volume and whatever else we have time for. With that said, Eric, welcome back to the show.
Oh man, what an intro! Thank you so much, brother. It's an honor to be back.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember how long the last one was, but like I said, people can check that out if they want to hear it. First of all, I want to congratulate you, man. You've been up to a lot lately. A lot of achievements in the title at WNBF New Zealand, I think it was, right?
Yep.
Second at Battle of the Bay, and then most recently earning your pro card at WNBF Australia. Tell us some of the highlights, not just the placings, but your experiences with the other competitors, how you've handled the demands of the schedule, that kind of thing.
To be honest, some of the highlights were some of the personal connections that I made with people backstage. I appreciate you highlighting the show I won, the show where I placed second, skipping the one where I placed third, and then my
There's
pro
so
card
many,
win.
man.
But the Washington State was a really, really cool experience. That was a four-person middleweight class, but it was really, really, really stacked. The winner of that, Ace Fuming Chong, he came from Hong Kong to compete, which is really cool. And him and his coach, they just expressed so much respect and honor for me as a competitor and just as a practitioner, that it was just so cool. And then I also got to meet Josh T. Bradley from he's actually doing he's finished his master's degree and he's going to go into his PhD. He works with Chris Barakat, and this is a really stacked lineup. Let me just say, like, placing third in that class is something that I'm equally as proud of as everything else I've done. If you looked at all four of those guys, Ryan, who placed second, actually is already a men's physique pro, and he competed in the pro show
Mm.
earlier in the day, and then jumped in because he wanted to get his bodybuilding pro card. Ace won, and he has some of the most ridiculous quads, top to bottom striated glutes I've seen. Insanely, he didn't even go to win on the overall. It was just a really, really stacked competition. And then myself in third, and then Josh, who I was mentioning, in fourth. And one of the personal connections we had was he shared with me, and it blew me away because he's a relatively young man compared to myself. I turned 40 this year. How his track coach in high school put him onto the muscle and strength pyramids as his first kind of entrance into training for bodybuilding. And it like made my brain skip, like that could be the first entrance. And I was both honored, humbled, and so jealous because I was like, wait, so you first started training at like 17, you had the collective wisdom, and research, like, stuff that I've had
For
that I
sure.
worked on for over, nearly 2 decades, and I was like, "Man," and then I thought, "Oh, shit," like, there are people out there who their first entrance into this is that, and it was a mixture of, like, fear, imposter syndrome, and, like, that's really cool, and, "Oh, I guess I'm a leader," like, "Oh, I'm too big, like, I shouldn't be a leader," and then, yeah, you can imagine that all that on top of show day. So I had that kind of experience at the Washington, which is really cool. That was one awesome moment. The Washington itself was also really cool because that's where Jeff won his pro card. So being in the audience and getting to see him compete as a pro at 52, and just knowing him personally, like, there's a lot of insecurity that goes on with bodybuilding when you're exposing yourself to that degree and you have these high level goals. And Jeff and I have different ones. He's a lot more naturally talented, I'll say, for the sport. And he might be able, he's taken it further and probably will be able to take it further than I have in my career. But he's also just turned 52, and he's not
Mm.
sure if he's still at his peak. And this show, when he looked at the pictures and he started to see, because you don't know until you started to be in shape, he was like, "I'm just as good, or if not better, than I ever have been, and this is a warm up show for me.
Mm.
Like I'm not in good shape." And he took second place in a very stacked, pro show. And I think it might have been, probably the best he's looked at this level of leanness at the very least. I think you can say that. And to get to see him do that at the same show where 14 years ago he got his pro card, and I competed in the overall against him. I won the light heavyweights, and we took a 2-day trip driving up from his house in Stockton, stopping at Grants Pass all the way up to Washington. 6-hour drive, then a 7-hour drive, and just getting all that time to connect. It was a really good way for us to connect with our roots, because 3D Muscle Journey was formed in those backstage conversations. So those are some moments around that show that were really, really awesome. But each show had connections like that. And the one that I just did in Australia was just incredible. I mean, I've been working to get my WNBF Pro card for I've been wanting it since I went to my first
Mm.
bodybuilding show, which happened to be an INBF show in Augusta, Georgia. That's the Iron Eagle Classic that many time heavyweight mid 2000s and late 90s pro natural bodybuilder Rodney Hilaire puts on. I got the opportunity to guest judge and view that and just be like, "Oh shit, like this is natural bodybuilding." And then I did my first show in '09. So this is something I've been pushing towards for my almost my entire lifting career. Sometime in 2006 was I was like, "Oh, this is a goal of mine." And it's taken me 17 years to achieve it. So, yeah, to get it is not sunk in fully.
Yeah, if only the muscle and strength pyramids existed in 2006 when you get, but
I could go
yeah,
back in time
yeah,
and
I
give
know.
myself the keys. Yeah.
Hey, I'm older than you, and I wish I could do the same, but we are what we are, and it's fun to hear behind the scenes, right? Because I mean, on the surface, we see the accolades, but as you know, the process behind that is where the magic happens. And to hear you talk about the psychology of it predominantly, right? And the imposter syndrome, and kind of I know the comparisons are inevitable. And, one year you might go up against a certain group of individuals, and you're the best, and the other, and the next time you yourself feel at your top, and yet the competitors are stacked, it sounds like a big mind game.
And that's exactly what
Yeah.
happened. I
Yeah.
I basically just dropped a placing each show I did. So I went from winning the overall New Zealand title to then placing second to then placing third. But objectively, well, subjectively, objectively, the feedback I got, everything I saw, the indicators were that I improved from show to show to
Mm,
show.
there you go.
Um, but I also went from harder show. Like, I went from our second inaugural WWF New Zealand show, where we do have high quality competitors, but it's a small
Mhm.
number. It's part of the reason why winning the overall, the panel decided, you're not quite ready for a pro card at this show. And I wasn't at my peak, which is also part of that decision. And then the next weekend, I was in a very tight battle for
Mm.
the number one spot. There was I don't know if it's a split decision. I didn't get full judges' feedback, but everyone was like, that could have gone either way. It was really cool to watch Lorenzo Elder get his WBF Pro card, because he's one of our 3DMJ athletes, and he very, very, very good competitor already. He's made noise as an NGA pro. So I placed second there, and I was like, okay, I'm still right there. I'm still right there. And then to shift to third, it took a little bit of like recalibrating. This is bodybuilding. So I'm getting better. My placings are getting worse. And then a little delayed satisfaction. You wait a couple weeks, and then boom, you win the pro card. So it's if you don't have a firm sense of why, and also being able to be objective about yourself and primarily prioritize and value self improvement
Mm,
and the other lessons you get from it, it can be an emotional roller coaster, because it is subjective and it's very dependent upon who shows up on the day. And one of the choices I made this season was, listen, one of my goals is, and I'm going to put it out there, and I'm going to value it, and I'm going to be honest with myself and honest with the world about it, is I want to get my card, and I'm coming to compete.
yeah.
And when you do that, you give up a little power over your own mental state.
Mm,
And I think that's a reality that a lot of people don't realize, is that once you have a goal that is not only dependent upon your will and efforts, beat your former version of yourself, improve, you give up a little power. You put yourself out in the world, and you say, well, there's other people who want to win,
for sure.
and there's judges who, you know, probably are less biased than I am looking at my own physique, and they're gonna rate it a different way. So, you also are giving up your ability to fully celebrate and enjoy a day, even if you did your best.
Mm,
So, I'm relatively proud of myself that I like, I did have my moments, like, when I placed 3rd or when I was inches away for, like, the 10th time in my career from getting a pro card when I placed 2nd to Lorenzo in my class.
mhm.
But I also knew that's what I signed up for, and I'm a big enough boy. I can handle it, and, uh, and that if I just kept pushing, that would happen, and here we are, so.
Yeah, and then you have the Worlds coming up too, and I think originally that was the place you were expecting to go for the pro card, right? I don't know if the Australia was a surprise. I mean, obviously, like you said, you hoped and planned to do your best at all of these, but was it a little bit of a surprise, or you were just having an aggressive goal and got there early?
So I thought, my best shot would be at the New Zealand show, and,
Okay.
because of the size of it, and then from there, I would just do the Washington. I mean, I didn't expect to get a pro card at the New Zealand show, but I just knew
Mhm.
based on the side of it size of it, you tend to get a crop of competitors compete one year, and then the next year you get a different crop, and I just didn't know of any New Zealand male bodybuilders who were competing that year who, would be like, who else is gonna come out who's gonna have a high caliber physique that's gonna be in the battle for the pro card. Um, and then, of course, there are people who showed up who I didn't know, and, like, it was still good. Like, I mean, I wasn't like I just walked away with it. But, yeah, I also knew that there'd be a potential with the panel and the number of people that I wouldn't get it. So, that's like, question mark here, but good, this is my best shot at winning the show, and that is what happened. And then I knew that both the Battle of the Bay and the Washington would be very hard fought. So we'll see what happens. I go to the States. These are basically this is on a circuit that I've done before. I competed in these in
Mhm.
2009, 2019. Like the Bay Area and like the West Coast shows are just very, very competitive, as are the East Coast shows. Not to take anything away from them in the WWF. So I knew that if I didn't get it at New Zealand, I needed to like improve, get tighter, and then just keep chipping away. And then I knew that the Australia show was going to be very big, and that would be hard as well. And I knew that, okay, there's a very real possibility that I'm going to have to just keep going all the way to Worlds, and then that's gonna be the hardest one, actually. But I also be at my best. So it was this interesting scaling component where the
Mm,
shows got harder as I was getting better. So I kinda thought like I had a relatively flat chance throughout, and it could happen in any of them.
got it.
Um, and I actually think Worlds would probably be the hardest to get your pro card at, because amateur Worlds is it's no joke, man. People who win their class, and especially if they win the overall in the amateur WNBF Worlds, are typically immediately competitive as a pro. Like when they do their first pro debut, they're winning money.
So
So,
so I
yeah,
don't know entirely how it works, but do you now compete on the 19th in the pro,
correct.
at okay, yeah, alright. So does
Yep.
that change the game for you or your prep?
I mean, in some ways, no,
Okay.
because I was going to bring my best and do what I had to do for Worlds and the timing. What it does change, it makes the day a little less complicated. Like if I had
Mm,
turned pro on at Worlds, I have to turn around and compete the next morning
I see.
after
Yeah.
being in an overall in the evening the night prior. So that's a bit of a challenge to peak for across 2 days. A lot of people struggle just to peak in the morning and the evening in the same day if they do a crossover or if it's a 2 day format show. So it would have been cool. And let's be honest, like it's taken me this long to be pro caliber, to be pro competitive at the world level is gonna take something monumental, which I'm really, really excited to chip away at.
It's awesome.
But, mainly, I'm going to Worlds to take pictures of LeBron as he dunks on me and be like, "Oh, that was awesome," you know?
There you go.
So and there is a rule, I don't know if it'll change in the future, I do hope that it does, but there's a rule where you have to compete within 1 year of getting your pro card to kinda, like, activate it and keep it, and then there's a 2-year, unless there's life extenuating circumstances, where you have to compete. I think there are some issues with what that forces competitors to do, especially in the bodybuilding divisions where you have to be so lean, and the timing of shows can put you in a really rough spot where you don't get to fully recover or you have to just keep dieting. So I'm actually very fortunate, and there's a reason why I decided I want to go to Worlds. So I basically backloaded everything. If you look at all the shows that I've done, I will have done 5 by November 19th, but the first one was September 30th. So we're talking like 5 shows in
Yeah.
8 weeks.
So okay, so you're saying by being able to, compete pro right away, it gives you this longer clock to the next one.
Correct,
Yep.
exactly. So I'll be
Cool.
able to take all of 2024 as an off season and then, looking at potentially competing end of 2025 or maybe early 2026 depending upon just dates and things like that. So, I
Cool.
think technically I'd have to be on stage by Worlds 2025 again, um,
It's
unless
exciting,
we can
man.
get
I
that
mean
rule
I mean,
changed.
it's, I'm not in that world, and I know a lot of people listening aren't, but we find it fascinating, and what it takes to get to where you are, the principles are still something we all aspire to, both the psychology of it, but even the practical matters of, leading out and building and all of that, because you are at the limits, learning about this. So why don't we jump into some of that, right?
Sure.
Segue here. Nutrition topics first, and then maybe some training. I've heard you talk about how you're not tracking this time around, right? You're not tracking or logging food. You're taking a more intuitive approach based on years of having done that before and developed that skill. What I'm curious about is if someone listening wants to understand the different levels of tracking, right? From a rank beginner to a very advanced athlete who has ambitious physique goals, how would you map that out for them? What are the three or different ways we can track when we're using flexible dieting that you think are appropriate?
Great question. The way I used to frame this, so this is some hot off the presses changes to the next edition of my books,
Cool.
Philip, was that there was good, better, and best. So to give more flexibility to people, and good is just hit within a calorie range, and typically like something like plus or minus 100. And there's a lot more nuance to that that I'll get into before someone just starts doing that. And then better is a protein intake, and then calories, and then best is macronutrients within a specific range.
Sure.
Because now you're making it more dialed in for the individual, and you're assuming that you've gotten the macros down, customized to the individual. And I presented this in my books as all positive framing, so it's all good. And even saying that, hey, in the off season, it may not even be best to do macros. You might just always do calories and protein, or even a habit-based tracking system. That was the evolution from the first edition to the second edition. The evolution to the third edition of my books that I'm working on is basically coming from the just repeated data and coaching experience and personal experience I've had where I really struggled to justify having relatively tight macro ranges and then being that different for people. Like if we were to shift your fat up or down 20 grams and trade that for 45 grams of carbohydrates, except when you're like down at like the very, very lowest intake and brushing ketosis or brushing a very low fat diet. Like, oh, I'm currently on 40 grams of fat and I want to do that. I'd be like, maybe not that. Or I'm on 100 grams of carbs and I want to increase my fats. And I'm like, okay, so we are going keto. We need to think about this and we'll
Sure.
modify some other things, right? Outside of those circumstances, I just couldn't really justify why am I telling people it's better or best to only be within, let's say, a plus or minus 10 or 15 gram range on these macro targets. And same thing for protein, kind of having more of a minimal threshold intake that's appropriate, and
Yeah.
knowing that if you go over it, it's fine, but it's not going to necessarily help you, except on individual cases where you notice more satiety or what have you. It's basically an unnecessary level of rigidity. So moving forward, I think the way or the eventual endpoint that I want people to get to once they've built some skills, which I'll talk about in a second, is that we have a calorie range that's appropriate. And then we simply have a minimum intake for fat, carbs, and protein. So what that might look like would be, hey, in a hard dieting phase, we have a minimum intake, and this is temporary because it's only while you're really trying to get real lean and for extreme goals of 20 to 30 grams of fat to get our minimum fat intake, right?
Hmm.
And then most of the time, we're going to bump that up to something higher, at least like the equivalent of 20% of calories, but I'd probably express it in an absolute amount to make sure we're covering our hormonal bases, transport of fat soluble vitamins, making sure everything's functioning well. And maybe that's like 40 to 60 grams. So that's kind of our minimum intakes in different scenarios. And then for carbohydrate, okay, what type of training do you do? Are you bodybuilding or powerlifting? Powerlifting, like we have some data suggesting that ketogenic diets and certain styles of powerlifting training without a whole ton of volume, you're probably fine. You're not may not be ideal for strength gain, but it still allows it. So maybe we have a minimum intake of 1 gram per kilogram if you have like strict like low volume powerlifting goals. And then as we move up to kind of the volume ladder, you're a bodybuilder, you're doing a lot more. Maybe we put that around like 2 to 3 grams per kg, right? And for the Americans, we're talking about a a gram to a gram and a
Mhm.
half per poundish, right? And then for protein, you know, when you're in the off season, when you're not being stressed by a caloric deficit, there's no theoretical reason to potentially be higher. 1.6 grams per kg, zero point 0.7 gram per pound, or right around there, or higher. And then if we're dieting, we bump that up to zero point 0.8, zero point 0.9, even 1 gram per pound, perhaps. And then after that, distribute your calories as you want. And now all of a sudden, many of the questions that people have and the flexibility issues and the logistical challenges and the issues with holidays, traveling, etc., get taken care of. I just don't, oh man, like I don't have to be fit into these things. And I find also as a coach that it makes people in different regions, in different environments, and in different social structures, especially when you have like an American coach, the first time they get like an Australian client and they're like, I don't know how to get that. Like, what is that? Or the first time they have a client from the UK or someone from a very, very non westernized country just happens to speak English. That's also very, very challenging. So
You mean they don't know how to get the food to meet macro? What are you saying? They don't know how to get what?
So what inevitably will happen at early stages of someone learning to track macros is they'll ask for some food advice,
Sure.
like,
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to
"Hey,
clarify.
how
Yeah.
how would I keep my fat low while putting my carbs high?"
Yeah.
And that looks very different in Singapore than it does in Australia than it
Sure.
does in Jersey, right? And that's something that I learned from moving overseas and having to do that myself, and also to some degree working with athletes overseas. And being able to just automatically allow someone to fit into that, and with that structure, I think is a much improved step. And it's just hard to justify anything else in my mind these
Mhm.
days.
Mhm.
That's one big structural change to where we want to get to. But I think getting to there is important because you were talking about different levels of skill and different types of tracking. There's a big difference between how the average bodybuilder or person in the fitness body composition world thinks of tracking when you say the word versus say a dietitian or just a general person in kind of the broader health and fitness space. If you say someone in our community like, hey, I'm doing some macro tracking, they think you have three targets and you're trying to hit them on a daily basis. But if you talk to some of those other people, it could simply mean I'm eating what I want based upon habits and kind of healthy things, and I'm just writing it down, but I don't have a target.
Sure.
And there's and so the conversations about the issues or the potential problems with these or the pitfalls or the side effects, oh, it makes you neurotic, all those things start to fall away when all you're doing is eating as you normally would, but tracking as kind of a mindfulness practice or an educational tool, which I really like for newbies. So people who are wanting to get more nutritional literacy, understand their diet, and look for areas where they can improve, and then we can kind of incrementally make more qualitative changes to their diet rather than giving them prescriptive three numbers. I think the best thing they can do is start reading food labels, writing things down, taking pictures of food with their phone, but not eating out, not making sure everything gets weighed to the gram. Eyeballing things, learning about some of the portion sizes, like weighing when you're at home after you've gauged, okay, I think that's a cup. Then see, is it a cup? Like, oh shit, it wasn't a cup, it was a cup and a half. Like, oh, I think that's about 100 grams of banana. Oh, it was 150 grams. Those are really important lessons. Looking on the back of your food label for the almonds, like, oh, I need a little protein. Let me grab some almonds. And you look at it and you're like, well, I'll be damned. Almonds are mostly fat, like things like that. Or then auditing what you've tracked for the whole week. And some things, but we haven't actively tried to change it. And you want to have a moderate fat, moderate carbohydrate, high protein intake. And you look and you've actually got like moderate, 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 and you're like, what do I need to do here? Well, I could switch this to low fat dairy. I can go from chicken thigh to
Mhm.
chicken breast or to turkey. All of those swapping and decision making games, or rather, those plug and play uh, opportunities are great to learn. And then you really start to understand how to turn food into numbers and vice versa, and how to make useful swaps. And that process can last a couple weeks before you even decide to try to hit certain targets. And you may not even decide to do that. You might just make these qualitative changes. You might just develop habits. You might create some meal structure and make sure I have a veg, a fruit, and a lean protein 3 times per day. And then I have some reasonable eating out options on top of that, and a protein shake after I work out. And I know that I'm going to eat to a 3 out of 5 satiety level at most in any meal, and do a few other things and get X number of steps. And it's all habit based, right? So That I think is a really, really critical phase that someone goes through before they even start entering the world of let me have target macronutrients, start weighing myself, look at my 2-week average and, weigh everything on the scale, eat out minimally and improve my accuracy and all those things so that I can go a macro-based a weight loss plan.
Yeah, and I'm laughing inside because I must listen to you just too much because this sounds exactly like the journey when I have a new client. If I ask them to just track their food and I forget to say, but ignore the targets, then on day two it's like, how do I get this? How do I hit? Oh wait, I forgot to tell you. Just ignore the targets and track and learn, and then you'll see. The other thing you mentioned was different countries. I don't know about what you think about this strategy, but I've found what successful is just looking at a past day that just happened to get close to the targets you intended, even if you didn't. What did you do then? Right? Just kind of
Mhm.
replicate that day. So you're talking about the learning, the awareness, the qualitative changes, satiety. I love that approach as well, satiety. So this would be somebody just getting started, either using a food logger or food journal, but not caring about targets. Okay, so now we're there. We're just a few weeks in. You also have a better understanding of your metabolism and your expenditure from doing that if you want. What's next?
Great. So let's make the assumption this person wants to take a tracked approach towards a fat loss journey, right? From there, once they got comfortable with that, we can audit that. We would sit down and go over their meal plan together. We would actually go, all right, so let's set up some targets, and they would be a calorie range and a minimum for all three macros, like I discussed earlier.
Mhm.
So okay, then we go, all right, based upon your energy intake and your change in body weight over the last 2 weeks, here's a guesstimate at what we think maintenance is. And therefore, we're going to drop X amount of calories, an appropriate size deficit for you. And now we have a calorie intake goal and minimum intakes for fat, carbs, and protein. The next thing I'd have them do, and this is a really useful tool, I want you to write your own meal plan or three for what that would look like and think of plug and play options in each one of those meal slots, right? So, beautiful. Now we're creating what I call a default diet for you. So this is kind of like I know what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis. If you're someone who really likes to plan and prepare, you can do Sunday cooking and make versions of this, or you can just do that when you're at home. You can have a version when I'm out at work and I need to go to lunch and I'm going to have, something on the go and only have one meal at home, or you can have a version when you're at home eating three meals and you can have a weekend version where you're doing this socially out at one meal and then making eating two or three meals at home, right? And you have a workout day and a non-workout day version. But I help the person actually write their own meal plans because then they take the skills they develop just tracking without targets and they put them to work immediately. And it's them writing the meal plan and with me kind of guiding over their shoulder. So they're getting even more experiential skills learned. And I can pick up things and go, actually, no, yeah, that you got to count that coffee or whatever, the creamer, it's something.
Mhm.
And then we start running that. And they go through that process. We're checking in, and they're going to build even more skills there. And we can also start observing how do they do with the level of precision, rigidity. What's the important amount? Does it create stress? Is this a good fit? And we adjust from there. Was it too aggressive? Maybe you're what'll sometimes happen is they're actually eating more than they think they are during that self-track period, and they're eating more accurately next. So we end up having this larger deficit than intended, and you lose a lot of weight immediately, which not a bad thing. People are
Mhm.
motivated, they have higher body fat, but then we go, hey, guess what? Let's bump your calories a little bit, right?
Yep.
So it's a very rewarding process, and that's kind of like your novice to intermediate stage. And then the main thing is to really work on the transitions and assess with them how sustainable does this feel all the time? And can we eventually we want to get to having this as the way we eat without necessarily having to write it down or log it if we develop these habits, right?
Mhm.
Because I think sometimes people get too caught up on the fact that they logged it rather than the fact that they did it. And it's not like you're not going to be at a deficit or not hitting good macros or not hitting, target calories if you don't write it down, you know?
Right, right, exactly.
And one of the rubrics that I have for people, it's an easy way to do this, and it's one of the skills I teach in this early stage, is once you've kind of basically followed this more or less habitual plan, this kind of default diet, and you have just your last meal left, which is often going to be like a protein-based meal at 8 or something like that if they're kind of bodybuilding centric, maybe some Greek yogurt or something, equivalent of a nice dessert, but it's also protein dominant, not high in carbs and fat. Hopefully will help in some way. minor thing. I don't force that on people, but that's a nice way to fit some more protein in.
Mhm.
As we go, okay, let's do an audit now. Like you don't need to track throughout the day. You can take pictures, you can write it down or whatever. And I even encourage you to not have to constantly be tracking because it's a distraction from your own life. And you look at, okay, what's left, right? And that's kind of the thing. You check your balance budget. Like, oh, I got 20 grams of carbs, 10 grams of fat, and 40 grams of protein. Okay, cool. So I can actually put a little bit of peanut butter and some blueberries in with my, non-fat, low carb, sweetened Greek yogurt, right? Do you need to track that? Do you need to write it down? Because you know exactly what you have left. It's 10, 20, like
Mhm.
40, right? And when people feel like that it's wrong if they don't write it down, if they don't track it, that is an indicator to me that they kind of have a little bit of OCD going on
Yeah,
there. Like, no,
sure.
I got to write it down. I'm like, well, I mean, you hit it and you checked, so that's one of those opportunities where I
That's the
just go,
completionist, the completionist in the world, right? With
exactly. That's
100%.
right. That's right. Well,
Yeah.
items were only 98%, even though I got all the kills.
The side
So
quest. Yeah.
exactly. So, I mean, I'm okay with people who get a lot of satisfaction from doing that, but I also want them just to be aware of when is the tail wagging the dog,
Sure.
and make sure that it's not causing stress as well, and making sure that I at least give them the skills if they choose to do a non-tracked version of this or a
Mhm.
non-logged version.
Before my coaching session with Philip, I was really struggling with staying consistent with my nutrition. I would do great Monday through Friday, but then on the weekends, I would just get a little too lax about it, have a tendency to overeat, and not pay attention to it as well. So, Philip really showed me the importance of being consistent day to day and sticking with a plan and executing the plan. Um, he also taught me the importance of rest and recovery days. Before I met with Philip, I was training usually 6 days a week, and he helped me realize that that was way too much. And so I scaled back to 3 days a week and started taking more rest days. And what I discovered was that really helped my overall performance when I did do a workout. He also helped me see that it's not a bad thing to take a rest day. I sort of equated rest days with feeling like a failure, and he really helped me get in that more positive headspace of a rest day being something really good for me. So from this point forward, I'm just looking forward to seeing more progress. I've been doing this for a month now, and I'm finally starting to see some progress in my numbers, and I'm really excited about that. So it motivates me to want to keep going, and I just appreciate so much the help that Philip has given me. He's always willing to answer questions, to offer resources that are totally free and very, very helpful. So I just want to say how much I appreciate that. Thanks, Philip.
Now, what inevitably happens if I probably can preempt your question of how do you get from the intermediate to kind of where I am? Is that where you want to go, Phil?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, cool. Okay, well, Eric, well, you're not tracking at all. How does that work? And in reality, I am tracking because I can't not track to some degree.
Mhm.
Within 2 seconds at any time of the day, I can be within 90% accuracy of what my nutrition is because I tracked religiously for 7 years straight. So that's something that is just an experiential skill that I've developed. The only time that's not the case is when I have mixed meals that are abnormal for me, or if I go out to eat and like I don't know the pesto fettuccine with I don't know like tuna, and I'm like okay, like I don't know how much they put in here. I have to guess, right? I have a
Yep.
placeholder, and it is what it is. You look online for a bit, you overestimate the fat, maybe in my case, whatever. Um, but most of the time I just know. And I also have a much greater connection of biofeedback than most other people. So I'm aware of what's an appropriate level of hunger at different body fat levels, at different phases, based on different goals, in season, off season, everything in between, all the way down from my current stage weight where I'm walking around, looking silly because my ears are sticking out of hats and I'm not even trying to flex and it looks like I'm flexing. And like, me at like shredded condition, can't sleep, all the way up to, oh, you're looking a little chonky there, Eric. I'm like, yeah, it's deep off season, bro. Um, so I know what all that feels like where I'm forcing food in because I don't, my body's like, yeah, I don't gain any more weight, to, oh man, I'm really interested in the flavor of my bread, kind of spectrum, right? I think without that, it's very difficult to modulate. Like, I know a certain level of suckiness that I should feel at this level on like, say, my fourth low day in a row, when I'm waking up in the morning and I'm 78.5 kilos shredded and I've been dieting since February. And that's very different from when you're 4 months into a contest prep diet and you're still 10 pounds over stage weight, right? You shouldn't feel that shitty, you're probably going to burn the candle at both ends, or it's just a little stint or a little flicker, and then same thing all the way to the off season. So that is what I so at a certain point, once you have all those biofeedback knowledge sets and that self-awareness, you can actually perform better by giving yourself a more of an auto-regulated range.
Mm,
So, for example, I have that kind of default diet structure, and on my low days, I typically am falling between 1,400 to 1,700 calories based upon energy levels, performance in the gym, my sleep quality. If I can't sleep through the night, I know I can only do that a few days in a row before everything falls off. So I need to eat towards closer to 1,700. I typically sleep a little bit better. What did my step count end up being for the day? And then just what's my general emotive state? How irritable am I? How clear headed? And, so you strike when you feel like you're fine, and you pull back a little bit when you feel like you're giving too much, based upon what giving too much means in the context of that phase of the
sure,
diet. And that's something that is, to some degree, you can teach that, but you kinda have to take your late stage, intermediate competitor or athlete or whatever, and this doesn't have to be a competitor, and then tell them that's the outcome you wanna get to, tell them the skills you use, and then go, "Alright, you need to try this," you
yeah,
know? Like, you give them a broader range and you tell them, "Feel like crap, like, don't just, you know, put on your hashtag grind face. We shouldn't be feeling that crap, but you need to assess." So, the coaching process moves from being less prescriptive to what you're actually doing on a day-to-day basis, to more auto-regulated, and then encouraging them, use your intuition and your knowledge and experience to get to the best outcome, and that's what Berto is doing for me. So, I'm
cool,
working with Alberto Nunez in a collaboration. He's like my coach and has been. He's my colleague, and a lot of the guidance he gives me is outcome based. And it does change at the end. This is an inevitable part, like where you're carb loading and you're trying to get a little leaner than
sure,
already shredded. So like right now, this morning, he said, "Hey, this weekend, I want to repeat the carb load we did, because 4 days later, you looked ridiculous and you got a little tighter, and maybe we can keep using that strategy." So today, higher refeed than you expected, tomorrow a little bit lower, and then we'll go for
sure.
3 or
It's
4
more
low days, and then
prescriptive.
we'll
Yeah,
start
yeah,
tapering up. So, yeah, that feels like, "Oh,
yeah.
what am I, back to 2009?" No, you're just 3 weeks out from Worlds.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's awesome stuff. Yeah, where do I even begin with all this? The idea of using biofeedback to learn about yourself. I see that a lot with individuals who aren't as advanced but are at maintenance. Right, at maintenance is
Mhm.
a good time to play around with this because you're
Yes.
not trying to induce a change in one direction or the other. You're not experiencing massive changes in your biofeedback. I see it a lot with lifters who they'll say, "Well, I'm gaining and I'm going at a certain rate of gain, but my lift just didn't move this week or even regressed a bit." And it's like, stop looking at the macros, just like overconsume to give you that energy because that's what worked in the past. Oh shit, all of a sudden the carbs will do it for me. So I think it's important, people listening, that they do build up to this, right? Track all of these things, because you're tracking without tracking is the way you put it. You're still
Yeah.
aware of hunger, stress, satiety, all of that. Pretty cool. Okay, thanks. Thanks
You
for
got it.
explaining all that, man.
No
It's good
worries.
stuff, and that'll inform my coaching as well going forward because there's some nuggets in there. Can't wait to see the new muscle and strength pyramids when they come out. So I wanted to ask for a specific scenario regarding the carb protein split, because you talked about minimums, which
Yep.
makes a lot of sense. But I often get the question like, well, what about the really high protein approach? 2.5, 3 grams per pound, and we're talking in a gaining phase, maintenance or a gaining phase, right, where you have the calories, and then it bumps the carbs down to what you suggested is basically approaching keto, sub 100. How important are carbs to keep that minimum? In that scenario.
I so this strategy has largely come from some of the Jose Antonio studies, where it looks like metabolic magic is happening. But I think it's important for people to understand that these are small sample size studies of people saying, "Hey, go do this," and they go out and then they just do that on MyFitnessPal, come back, and then we look at the outcomes. anytime this has been more rigorously and empirically tested, like metabolic reward, although it didn't have lifting, if you look at some of Bray's research in 2012, or other studies where we, have higher protein intakes in gaining phases, we just don't see this effect. So I really think what's actually happening in these maintenance phases is people are struggling to consume those levels of protein, actually not getting there, and their reported calorie intake is lower than it actually is, and they're doing some recomping that's accelerated by the fact that they're coming in and out of slight deficits, but the net effect
Mm.
is some gains there. I think that's a more likely outcome than trying to explain the energy intake differences, and that something magical happens when you go from 2.2 grams per kg of protein to 3.5, that it is unexplainable by physics, but will magically make you recomp. I just don't think that is the case, and I think for there's a saying, for extraordinary claims it requires extraordinary evidence, and the Jose
Sure.
Antonio studies, I love them, I'm glad they exist. They are small sample size, more observational style, outpatient, not well controlled, cool studies on protein, but they're not robust investigations that are designed to answer that question definitively as to what's the mechanism by what we're seeing here. All we know is that, hey, if you tell people to eat, close to 2 grams per pound of protein, sometimes they're not going to gain weight and they'll lose a little bit of fat and they'll improve lean mass, or they'll gain lean mass and very little body fat. Okay, cool. But that's like black, but that's a black box there, right? We just know that
Mhm.
we told them to do that, and that's what happened. Okay. So if someone wants to do that, I'm more than happy to facilitate them trying.
Sure.
Nothing wrong with experimenting,
I'll
right?
just try it
So
out. Yeah.
yeah, so go for it. And in my experiences, those are typically short lived, and people don't often get what they hope out of it. But it does work, I will say, in the instances where you have athletes who struggle to not be in a state of a larger surplus than intended in the off season. They want a lean gain, but inevitably they start gaining a pound a week. This can be very useful. And I think it has more to do with being inconvenient.
Mm.
Like, it is very difficult to eat that amount of protein, make meals, and it does drive your food choices away from things that are hyper palatable, and it
True.
makes it hard to go
And
out
high
to eat.
satiety as well, doesn't it? I mean, it just makes you feel stuffed.
Yes, and I think the data on really, really, really high protein intakes is not super clear for the long run on the satiety effect. It seems
Okay.
to increase satiety and then it starts to level off, and it's more similar to a moderate intake around, like, a
Okay.
gram per pound. But I don't think the inconvenience factor goes away. Like, if
Mm.
you have to eat 350 grams of protein and 150 grams of carbs and 70 grams of fat per day, what does that diet look like? And does it include eating out? Does it include things that are really, really tasty? There's
Mhm.
a reason why carnivore is a rage, because when you actually cut out 90% of the foods you eat, yeah, you're probably not going to have a whole lot of GI issues in the short term, and you're going to be in a deficit. You're going to lose weight, and you're going to be covering your bases protein wise. So if it's a protein modified fast, it's a
Mm.
better approach than just doing like the grapefruit diet, right? So anyway, I think, I find that those approaches typically are short-lived, but some version of it can be useful just because it changes your food of options if you're someone who slides towards bulking too hardcore, and if you need some rules, like some macros basically, which end up being rules de facto, they don't feel like rules, but you like to hit your target numbers, and that keeps you in check, and you go to the restaurant, and you're like, "Okay, well, I can't. Okay, the steak's too high in fat. All right. Okay. Well, the carb. Oh no, no. The chicken is not enough protein, but you have to really think about it.
A big plate of whitefish. That's all you're gonna have.
Exactly. Right. You know.
Yeah.
So it makes things more challenging to keep making that same error, and that's, hey, if that works, go for it. But generally, in that situation, I would encourage the person towards something maybe a little more moderate,
Mhm.
um, and just make sure that they weren't under any illusions of like the magic of protein. I'd probably
Sure.
have a similar conversation that we just had. Probably asking more questions, like, this isn't a consultation, but yeah.
But what about the illusions of the anti-magic of carbs, so to speak, or the
Mm.
anti-catabolic effects of carbs? Like, aren't isn't someone missing out significantly when they could be eating 3 or 400 and they're eating 80 or 100?
To be honest, I'll tell you what, this is
Okay.
basically a scenario when you're eating, let's say, 350 grams of protein and 150 grams of carbs instead of swapping it. It's it's basically saying, "Hey, I like to get in my car door by rolling down the window and then jumping through." Right? Because you're asking, "Hey, liver, how much can you upregulate, gluconeogenesis? Like,
Mhm.
how much can you convert to protein?" And it's
That's
pretty
right.
good. Like you
Yeah.
can actually get to the point where, like 40% of your carbohydrate is getting produced from protein conversion. If there's some It's a paper, a theoretical paper by Billsborough and Mann, which always stands out in my mind because it kind of has these questions about like the upper end thresholds of theoretical protein intake in humans. So, I generally present protein as something that's not a metabolic substrate primarily, it's for structural repair. But if you give your body twice what it needs in protein, it's going to make a lot of that into carbohydrate and like ketone
Yep.
bodies. Like,
Yeah.
amino acids are they're ketogenic or they're glucogenic. So it's going to start making other substrates
Sure.
from that, cleaving off those amines, recycling those things. And it will that's why protein has a higher thermic effect than other macronutrients. TEF's a little higher. That's why high protein diets burn a few more calories, and you would be maxing that out a little bit. You might be gaming the system so you notice that, hey, I can actually eat 100 more calories when I do it like that, and I'm actually, eating
Mm, true.
more than twice my normal protein intake, and that might be worth it to you. But again, it's not calories you're really going to enjoy. It's another, ounce of whitefish on your plate, right?
Yeah, when you're probably already having a challenge eating enough anyway for you to
Yeah.
get into that gaining phase. All right, so, straddling nutrition and training here, how do I wanna ask this question? So, imagine you have a kind of an intermediate athlete, which probably a lot of people listening, they've gone through their newbie gains, maybe they're a year or 2 into effective training, they understand the basics of nutrition like you've said it, and they just wanna have the most efficient next 2 years, in terms of physique. So, let's say physique specifically
Mhm.
is their goal, not their 1RM, for max
Sure.
force production or something. What would that look like from a periodization strategy? And I know it's like a general universal thing we're talking here, and everyone's different, but people always ask, how long should I be cutting, bulking? What does that look like? Do I use mini cuts? That whole thing. I don't know if we can generalize it.
I think we can give some constraints to help
Mhm.
people. So we recently just published a paper on different rates of weight gain and change in body composition. It just came out, Sports Medicine Open. We had a preprint out before that. Open access, feel free to read it. And we had three different groups. One group was eating at maintenance or attempting to. One group was an attempted 5% surplus, and one group was an attempted 15% surplus. And they were adjusted by a dietitian in real time and do video consults with them based upon how their weight was progressing. And then we looked at biceps and triceps muscle thickness and quadricep muscle thickness changes while they're doing a 3 times per week full body program aimed at generating hypertrophy for 8 weeks. And there were some really interesting findings. For one, we regressed all of them, which just means that we plotted all of them together as one big group, plotting change in body mass versus change in skin fold thicknesses. So the sum of all their skin fold thicknesses, not a derived body fat percentage, but a very accurate measure of subcutaneous fat added together. And also all of the different muscle thickness values and also their 1RM strength gains. And just focusing on the gains they made, the strongest predictor of gaining more body weight was gaining more skin fold thicknesses. And that was it explained about 50% of the variance in that. So if you want to know, am I going to put on body fat? That's primarily influenced about all the things you could do. 50% of it is influenced by how large is your surplus, not the content of the surplus necessarily. And I would guess the rest of it would be related to your training age, and gaining capacity, right? Those intangibles.
Mhm.
But we know for sure that if you put yourself in a big surplus, you're more likely to gain body fat. Another thing we found was that there was a very, very, very weak relationship with putting on slightly more bicep muscle thickness, but not quads and also not triceps. And it's not because the biceps are magic. It's just when you look at the training program we wrote, that the biceps out of all the muscle groups that we measured got the most training volume and was going to failure most of the time. So if you are pushing pretty hard to grow a certain muscle group, it's going to have a little more gaining potential, if you will. And you could, but not that much. I mean, we're talking that there's 10 times the strength of evidence. We used a Bayes factor. It was like 14 point something versus 1.4, which is just kind of like an odds ratio, meaning that, hey, if you're in a larger surplus, you're 1.4 times more likely than someone in a smaller surplus in the study to put on more biceps thickness. but you're 14 times more likely to put on more
Put
skin
on
fold
fat.
thickness.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah.
Yep.
So it's certainly a lot of variance between individuals. But yeah, so training hard is important, and not being in too large of a surplus is important for not accumulating unnecessary fat gain, right? Now, it'd be easy to go, okay, well, then therefore you should be closer to that 5% surplus. And, maybe you could just try maintaining, whatever you want to call it. But the problem with that is that that's hard advice to follow. And this came when we looked at our nutritional data. So we had a 5% surplus group, 15% surplus group, and we regressed them as one big group, which was useful. And the reason we had to do that is because the 5% and the 15% group had the same mean body weight change, meaning that it's really hard for people to follow a very, very
Accurately be
specific
in that
surplus.
surplus. Okay. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so on average, not everyone, but on average, a 5% surplus turned into a 15% surplus, right? And the 15% surplus had some people who were in a 5% surplus. So the precision there is, and it's not like we didn't have a familiarization phase. It wasn't like they didn't have, a dietitian guiding them. They had the equivalent of like one-on-one coaching, like you and I would provide online. And some of the people in the study were pretty advanced.
Mm.
So it wasn't for it just being a bunch of random soccer moms doing something they'd never done before, right? And sorry to pick on soccer moms. I don't know why I chose
I
that.
knew you were going to say
Yeah, and
that.
I just felt bad, like, "Oh, man, there's a bunch of people that are bad at tracking. I don't know why it has to be, soccer moms. Jeez." I just got these internal biases against, soccers and moms. I apologize. But, so anyway, I think the lesson here is that you do need to figure out what's feasible first, and that's gonna dictate your approach. Because if you're working with a bodybuilder, sure, you can say, "Hey, I want a 5% surplus, and I want you to only gain a pound a month." But if you're working with your general fitness enthusiast, that might turn into 2 pounds a month anyway, and then they just feel like they're failing. So then you go, "Okay, well, what's the slowest rate we can gain reasonably?" If it's appropriate for the person's goals. Like, if they're an intermediate, you probably want a little bit slower just because 'cause it'll put on body fat, but it's also gonna create a good environment for gains. And then from there, that'll dictate your cutting schedule. Because like, how high should I get it? So it might be something like 4 months of being in a like a gaining phase, and then a 1 month mini cut. That's probably the highest ratio of cutting to gaining I would have, just so you have more time to do it. And ideally, I'd like it to be less frequently than that. If the
Less
person
frequently
is
meaning you mean you want to stretch everything out. So like
correct.
6 months of building to like a 6-week mini cut or something.
Yeah, or even just
Or
a month, because that
or
means they
oh,
gained
I
less
see.
body fat
Okay.
in that period, right? And also, there's other factors that are gonna impact this. So it's basically how close do we think you are to your genetic ceiling, and then what's your current body fat level and how comfortable are you with it? Because if someone's relatively high in body fat, the answer may just be we do a conservative cut, and we know that they're gonna have a good chance of actually putting on muscle mass. They'll probably recomp quite well. And if they're a newbie, they're probably gonna and let's say they're higher in body fat than they otherwise like to be, we can also just kinda eat at maintenance and let body recomposition do its thing until it seems like it's stopping. And I think you can run the clock.
What about someone who's gone through this and they're like kind of at that steady state? I don't know, for a
Yes.
male, 15% body fat, something like that. And they just want like what's the, put it on autopilot for the next 5 years. What would the cycles generally look like for most? Do you line it up with the seasons and life? Is that kind of a good approach? Or do you have you seen a certain ratio and length of time be more optimal?
I prefer like a minimum 4-to-1 or 6 or 8-to-1 ratio. The slowest they can gain while still being able to check that they're gaining, and focusing more on progress in the gym. So this looks more like, hey, having a 4 to 8 month period of only gaining like a pound a month. And then we look up and we're like, okay, we've gained, 5 to 10 pounds. How are we looking? And, a good answer for someone in that scenario would be like, yeah, it was probably about 2/3 body fat, you know? And I mean, that's incredible, right? That means you put on 3 to 4 pounds of muscle, in the better part of a year. I ain't doing that, but I think if someone can do that in a relatively late stage, that's fantastic. And then you clean up and you rinse and repeat. And at a certain point, you do get to a place where that is becoming less and less and less possible, and you're getting better and better and better and better at tracking, and it starts to look a little more individualized, and you might stay lighter, and it's more just about creating a good training environment and a nutritional environment and kind of clustering into a surplus and just figuring out what time frame that looks like, and then what level of precision and control and structure do you need to not let less than ideal habits kind of take hold.
Got it.
where you're like, whatever, I'm not trying to gain weight, so it doesn't really matter. Like meal frequency slips and protein intake drops. Like that's what you want to actually avoid at the advanced
Mhm.
level.
Yeah, and the idea of just keeping the training, hard and
Yes.
sufficient the whole time can end up being the holdup for a lot of folks once they dial in the nutrition thing because of life and your programming and
9 out of 10
everything else.
times,
Yep.
that is what it is for advanced
Yeah.
lifters. It's not nutrition,
Yeah.
right? Unless they are, because you typically don't get to be an advanced lifter when you chronically undereat. That actually
Okay.
ends up holding you back. So most advanced lifters that I've found, they are either just they get too heavy, or they're able to maintain, but they're not seeming to make any progress. And the guys who get too heavy, like sometimes they cut down and they see that nothing changed, and then there is a nutritional modification just so they're happy in general. But for the objective goal of did we put on lean mass, it's the same for both of those two people. The person who's better at not getting too heavy and kind of hangs around 15%, or the person who is floating up to 25% if we're using this kind of male archetype. And you can add 8% to those numbers for women. And in the case where the person is not struggling to get too heavy, I would even say 10 out of 10 times, unless it's like a sleep issue or something else. If in the cases where it could be nutrition or training, it's always training
Got it.
because they're just done.
Yeah.
Which does I mean, we don't ever accept that to be the case, but they could just be like, now I'm actually, I've been training for 30 years, and we're just gonna focus on other aspects of the process and focus on living in this awesome body I built for as long as possible, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But most of the time, what you're doing is the training is obviously not stimulating muscle growth because nutrition is permissive, right? Okay, we have an environment that would support growth if there was a growth stimulus, but there's not. So let's talk about specialization cycles. Let's take a look at how much volume you're doing per muscle group. Let's really audit your proximity to failure. Let's audit your recovery. Are we doing too much or too little? Do we need to focus on these groups of muscles and not that, etc.? And that becomes everything. So focusing on training is it because you could take an early stage intermediate or a late stage novice, and anything reasonable will get them good gains. And you probably are splitting hairs if you try to make them optimal. But when you get to an advanced level, like for me, the difference between 2019, why I was close to a pro card but didn't get it, and this year, and because there were physique changes beyond just getting leaner, which I'm only happening now. I think on stage last Saturday I was as lean as I was at the Mayhem in 2019, but I placed second at that show, and it was arguably a similar competitive level of show. But this one, I was second overall and got a pro card. So what happened? And the difference is that I probably put maybe 100 grams of tissue on certain key spots. You know, so I have more medial delts. I had more back. I had more back width. So the back width and the shoulder width, it really, for my narrow structure, it makes such a huge difference. It's a disproportionate influence on some poses and my bodybuilding outcomes. So how do you track that? 100 grams
Yeah.
over so that's the type of thing where it was all down to specialization cycles, training, implementation. My calves also improved a little bit. I was doing like an orthotic stretching device, so there's a lot more that goes into that side of it when you're at an advanced level.
Yeah, so, do you have time for, like, couple of questions? 1 or 2 more? I know we're at the bottom of the hour here.
Yeah, I got like 5 minutes. Does that work?
Okay. Yeah, that
Yeah.
works. I'll take all my training questions and kinda smush it into one because you touched on the key variables, right?
Mm,
That all come down to individualization for you, right? The volume and your programming and recovery and all of that.
yeah.
So my question is for like a late intermediate or even an intermediate, because again, I think that's if you think of the bell curve, right? A lot of the population here, how do they find that sweet spot without looking back and thinking they wasted the last 2 years of their lifting? How do they find that individualized volume sweet spot? They're not a programming guru per se. They might have a coach, but like where is it? Is it effective reps? Is it, how you feel with your biofeedback? Is it just trial and error? What is it, Eric?
I think for one, philosophically, you're now at a point where you're entering a phase where you have to be willing to invest in a strategy that's going to take a while to assess if it pays off, and know that there's no other way around it. And the only other way to go is to always be looking at the grass being greener and program hopping, and end up wasting
Mm.
more time than you otherwise would have versus committing to something for, say, 4 months, 6 months, seeing if it worked, and being open to the idea that maybe it didn't, but that's a valuable lesson. So that's the philosophical shift one. The second one, though, is that you are going to have indicators of whether or not it's working along the way. And like, it's a little different if you're just purely a competitive bodybuilder at the advanced level. But if your overall goal is progress and growth, you do want to assess your training logs. And over a reasonable time frame, you should be seeing performance trending up in the stuff you're focusing on. And let's say, early, mid stage, intermediate, you're not specializing on any muscle group yet. You're still running, let's say, an upper lower split, and you want generally everything to grow. You should generally be seeing that over the course of, say, a mesocycle of training, let's say 6 to 12 weeks of training, that you're getting a few more reps or the same loads at slightly lower RPE, and that you're like your 8 to 15 RMs are clustering upward, or you can sustain those reps across multiple sets. And there should be indicators that you are, with the same technique, able to lift heavier or from more reps, or that it's getting better, cleaned up. Like, oh, like I'm going increased range of motion and better depth, and I'm not using as much momentum, even though it's the same RPE and reps. And if that's not happening, then I would be comfortable saying, you know what, you put in a solid, 2 mesocycles of, you did 2 4-week blocks of this training that should be resulting in at least uh, a slight majority of your lifts going up. And if they didn't go up at all, I think then you can go back to the drawing board. So that lag time does start to extend out, but I think because you see larger changes in performance than you do in your physique, but they are indicating one another indirectly at least, that you can not let the amount of time pass for too long before you make some type of change to your programming. That is informed by that. So let's say you commit, you go, I'm going to try a lower volume, closer to failure program. Awesome. Okay. At the 8-week mark, is it working? And you're assessing your progress. If not, then you go, okay, maybe that wasn't it for me. But now I've at least explored going close to failure. So now I'm going to try to see, okay, can I keep the same proximity to failure? How's my recovery? I'm going to go up 20% in volume, right? And then see what happens. And if the only thing you notice is that your recovery takes a hit, and now it's really hard because you have to do another set on everything going to failure still, but you don't actually make objective improvements, then you redial it again. Okay, well, I'm going to pull my volume back even further, and or rather, my proximity to failure back even further. I'm going to train at a 1 to 3 RIR most of the time, but now I'm going to make another 20 or 30% increase in volume and see how it goes. And you start to dial in onto what works well for you. And then you could apply that same kind of mindset to exercise selection,
Mhm.
which I think actually gives you faster biofeedback. Am I feeling it in my target muscle? Is that
Sure. Yeah.
when I introduce these new exercises, do I get DOMs in the place I'm supposed to get it? So there's a different set of rubrics, but similar process. And then also, hey, let me take the same amount of volume, same exercises, etc., and manipulate the frequency and distribution throughout the week to try to see if I can get the most out of my recovery and get the least bleed over into subsequent sessions.
I think that last point is really important because people are hearing volume and they think it's up or down. And what you're saying is it could be the distribution of the volume.
Yes.
And I found that myself, especially in a cut going from like 3 days to 6 days actually works for me because I can
Yes.
spread it out, even though now I'm working out 6 days a week. It sounds counterintuitive, but definitely want to experiment. So, man, this has been great. Eric, as always. Last question, where do you want folks to find you?
Yo, I think just based upon that last question you gave me, what I'd really recommend people
Okay.
do is they go to the 3DMJ Vault. This is our online learning platform for people interested in either competitive or non-competitive bodybuilding. We have a really cool course called Bodybuilding Program Design, which is exactly what we just talked about. It is you starting with an inside-out approach to programming. How do I set up my own individual volume targets, needs, etc. for me, apply it to my life, and then how do I experiment with it? And it's a 3 coach collaboration, myself, Alberto Nunez, and Brad Loomis, teaching you basically how to individualize your training for people at that stage where they know, like I said, almost 10 out of 10 times, that's the reason you're not progressing. And enables you, instead of just starting with a split that kind of shoehorns you into, I have to do 4 upper lower days or push pull legs or something like that. You start with, no, not I'm going to start with a split. What are my individual needs? And then the training program or the split becomes an emergent property of that. So it's inherently much more customized. And then how do you audit it and change it over time?
Awesome. Couldn't plan it any better. Go to the 3DMJ Vault. It's called the Bodybuilding Program Design. I'll put that in the show notes. I really appreciate you taking the time again to come on for a second time onto Wits and Weights, Eric. Best of luck with the rest of the contest season and everything else. And we'll definitely be in touch. Thanks for coming on.
It's been a true pleasure. Thank you so much.